Good morning, everyone. Matt Johnson here. Everyone's having a good day so far. I think we'll give everybody maybe about a minute, and then we will go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So, again, Matt Johnson here with the VRC VitalECM, FileBound team, and here to kind of show you a continuation of our meeting for the PSI Capture. So really the next stage, if you will, of this series. And so today we're going to really cover templating with PSI Capture and how we can do vendor statement reconciliation inside of FileBound. And we'll kind of touch briefly on the FileBound side, but really we'll kind of focus mostly on the PSI Capture side today. And then also we'll hop out and show you how to create templates within PSI Capture, how to modify those templates, and then also kind of get into what it looks like when we work with you to build a profile for a particular vendor. So yesterday we spent a lot of time talking about the different types of vendors and how we can create a special profile for them to help create a lot of automation, if you will, for some of those larger vendors. And today we're actually going to take a vendor that we've not created a profile for before, and in Ditch Witch, and then actually create a profile and kind of show you through some of the decision-making processes that we go through, and make the template, and then run that invoice through, and show you how it kind of all works and feeds together. So. All right, with that being said, I'm just going to exit out of the PowerPoint there. And so let's get into PSI Capture. And again, I always start my capture import step. And what I want to go into is this vendor statement demo. And once I'm in the vendor statement demo, then what I need to do is import some of my documents. And then when I highlight those documents here, I'm just going to hit this start. And then, of course, PSI Capture is going to import those statements. So again, vendor statements, so we've got the different types of data here. And when I hit close batch, I'm going to process those invoices forward. They're going to extract the data off of those statements. And it's going to look a little bit different. It's going to look different than what you would see in a normal invoice, because we're going to grab actually the data out of the tables of that document. Okay. So in here, I think about this statement. So I'm kind of grabbing the vendor name and number, based off of the template, and then I'm grabbing the different values here from each of the different lines. So really, I'm grabbing each of the different invoice numbers, off of here, the different dates, and the invoice totals. And really, we can kind of grab whatever you like, right? So I'm going to grab statement date on this one. Here, this statement kind of has a description, so I'm just going to grab that, because we've got the data there. This one really didn't have a description on this particular invoice, and that's okay. Again, we're kind of making it what they call a table extraction template to grab all of the data off of there. And this works well as far as these kind of smaller templates. But what I did want to show you is a much larger statement, like an 11-page statement, because that's really where you start seeing the value in this table extraction. So I kind of had one created already, and so yeah, so you can see this Stanley, if you will, statement, and it's got 11 pages on it, right? And it created all of these hundreds and hundreds of rows, but it grabbed all of the data and click on the zoom zone. And so as we kind of navigate through, it quite literally just grabs the data and kind of fast forward here a little bit, and you'll see then that it'll eventually then start jumping. Now we're on page 2. So it really just kind of continues on just like the invoice does. And then once we get even to the bottom of all this data from this document, then it's going to place it to the end and quite literally stops at that last row and kind of gets all of our data there. So really kind of a powerful tool to grab a lot of data. And so let me do this. I'm just going to click back to home and suspend that, but I want to minimize PSI for a moment. I'm going to go back into my PowerPoint, and I'm going to show you what that looks like from a standpoint of importing it into FileBound. So, okay. So with the statements, what we do is we actually create a new project in FileBound called vendor statements. And that's kind of what you see in the top left-hand side there. And when we upload this information, we're kind of uploading things like, statement dates, vendor name, vendor number, those types of things. And we're taking that table data and we actually create this table below to store it. So we're uploading the invoice number from this column, the invoice date. If it happened to be a credit, sometimes vendors will have 2 columns, like a debit and a credit column on their statements. So we can grab that if need be, the total, and then as far as the status, in the fields to the right of that, that's actually data that we're auto filling in, if you will, by doing a lookup from the invoices inside of FileBound. So basically, when the invoice or when the statement comes in, we automatically do a check. We take the vendor number and invoice number, and we take a look and find that inside of FileBound, and then we fill in this data. And the key piece is that current status field, because then we know specifically that it's been posted, or it's been paid, or it's still in process or whatnot. So you kind of know where things are at. And if there's no match, then you can imagine, if there's no match, then that row would be blank, right? So now you can kind of scroll through those, lines and lines of statement information and identify, hey, here's the 2 invoices I need to be worried about or take action on or whatnot. So ultimately, that's the end goal, is to take the data off the document, query FileBound, if you will, and then return the results. So that way, when you're looking at this statement, you can really easily, quickly identify what's matched and what doesn't match. You could take that a step further. We could add a comparison between the dollar amount from the statement to the dollar amount of the invoice as well. I mean, we can do a lot of different things once we have the data off of the statement. So just wanted to share that with you because it's kind of a fun, powerful thing. If that's something you're interested in, definitely let us know. We can, kind of get something like that scheduled and get you taken care of in that regard. So, okay, so I'm gonna close out of here and go back into PSI Capture. So now really from here on out, we'll really be talking about templating, creating templates. Oops. Sorry, wasn't clicking on it, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to kind of back up to our original import that we started with in our first meeting yesterday and import our first batch of invoices through. So actually, I think those landed in my archive folder, so let me go grab those. Go. Okay, and then I'm going to let this process through. And if you remember yesterday, there were 2 invoices that we did not have a template for, so we'll use those as our examples today and make templates for them. All right, so here's our our steel invoice, and if you remember, our vendor number on this one is STIH01. And so what I'm going to do is say, okay, I know the vendor number. Then to make a template, you notice that there's a section up here at the top called Form ID. And instead of editing a template like what we had done yesterday, we're actually just going to add a new classification form, is what they call it. And this panel is pretty simple. We'll just simply enter in the form ID there. And then as far as the rest of the fields above here, we typically don't have to use any of those unless you're a customer out of Canada. And in the Canada invoices that they have to work with, unfortunately, they have a lot of different types of formats when it comes to the date. So sometimes they'll get a month, day, year type of invoice, sometimes a day, month, year invoice, and sometimes a year, month, day. It's kind of a mix and match depending upon the vendor and what they give them. So in that case, then if you're in Canada, you'll have a record type, and that'll just say, okay, this vendor is going to have this format. So that way we can translate that properly. So for those of you that may not know, obviously you can imagine if you get an invoice on May the 3rd, right? Is the vendor giving you, is it March 5th or is it May the 3rd? And so identifying that record type is helpful for them. But then after that, everything remains the same for both types of customers. So that's really the only one off there. So our first step in this process is, again, identifying the form name. And a lot of times we use the vendor number because we can return a vendor number from our lookup that way. And then here we want to identify what are the keywords on this invoice that make it unique from other vendors in our invoice pool, right? And so it could be as simple as a phone number, right? So, okay, this vendor's phone number is this. Obviously, no other vendor is going to have that phone number, and away we go. Sometimes vendors, if they have multiple locations, they will change the phone number on their invoice based off the location that you buy from. So phone number may not be a great fit. So then you start looking at other things. Can we use the name or the address on the remit to perhaps, or is there something else identifiable on there? Some people include their Dun and Bradstreet number. Some people have other unique numbers that you can use or combinations that you can use, which is great. The one thing I try to avoid is the larger lettered logos, or even picture logos, just because of the fact that we are still using OCR. And once you get into those larger sized fonts and images, if you will, it's not always 100% consistent. So we try to use words. We can use it anywhere on the page. In this case, I'm just going to grab Mid-Atlantic Steel. And I feel pretty confident that, hey, none of my vendors are going to have that phrase on their invoice. And then when I select that, you'll notice it creates a kind of a pink zone. And so right now what PSI is saying is anytime an invoice comes in, and then this area of the invoice, Mid-Atlantic Steel, exists, then that's going to mean we're going to use this template. And I'm totally fine with keeping that zone like so. You can also use the toggle here and change it to header. The benefit to that is if you're in a situation where people might be scanning these invoices, or if you have a feeling that the header might change a little bit depending upon the type of document you get, then changing that to header was not a bad idea at all. And that's kind of common what we do with a lot of things. It may be a situation where you're looking at this invoice and say, well, Mid-Atlantic Steel is going to work, except they've got multiple locations, and I've got a different vendor number for each of those locations. So maybe my STIH01 is the Mid-Atlantic Steel that I've got to remit to this PO box. So then maybe I'll say box 24696. And when I highlight that, now I've got two rules, if you will. And then in PSI Capture world, we have to match both rules in order for that to work successfully. Not too common that we have to do two. Typically, we can get away with one, but certainly if you've got a vendor that is the same vendor name, if you will, but multiple vendor numbers, using a second layer or second item is great. Could be maybe they give you an account number, one for each of the different vendor numbers. So you can kind of play around and decide what works best for you. And then, of course, just like I did there, if you decide that you don't want to use one of those, you can certainly delete. So that's really, in a nutshell, this step. It's really pretty simple. As you're doing it, it's just a point and click and away you go. And then now we're into our zones. So what we try to do with the zones is pre-create a lot of the fields so that you don't have to go through the process of building the zones, etc. And that really what you're left with doing is just aligning the fields to the spot on the page to grab the data that we need. And so basically in these 7 zones here, I just kind of work top to bottom. I use the edit pencil to edit the zone. So when I hit that pencil, it's going to ask me, hey, do you want to see the words that we found? I always say no. And then it kind of brings me into here, and I take my zone here. I just click anywhere in the middle of it and kind of center it around what I'm after. So if you notice, I've got the word invoice number there. I'm just going to kind of place this box around there. I generally don't have to resize that zone. The size of it isn't necessarily beneficial unless I feel like things are going to move on me, and I'll explain that here in a little bit. But what you'll see is when I move that zone there, it gave me 2 pink zones, and those are called the child zones. And I don't want 2, I just want 1. And so that means what I need to revisit is my anchor expression, and that's in this top section over here. So on the right-hand side of that line, I'm going to click on this T, which is kind of our text select, if you will. And then I'm going to say, instead of the word invoice, because I can see that invoice is in there 2 times, I'm going to use the word invoice and then NO after it. And so now when I reselect my expression, you can see it gets rid of that duplicated child zone, and now I'm left with just 1 zone. And in looking at this, I mean, that looks pretty good. I might just slide it over and slide it up, but in essence, that looks great to me. So I'm just going to simply hit Save Smart Zone. And then I'm going to go to my next field, date. And again, I'm just going to say, I don't care about the words because I'm going to move things around. And then I line it up here. And so now I'm looking at, okay, ship date. Well, maybe that's not the one I want, but I start looking around here and, maybe that is the one I want because I don't really see another date. So let's do that. And then we say, okay, oh, looked at it wrong. I got the word invoice date, right? So let's take a look and say, well, invoice DT, that's not going to interfere. So instead of using and redrawing my expression, since I only have 1 pink zone, then I just have to slide my pink zone up. So this is a great example of an invoice and in a field where it doesn't necessarily matter the word you use for your anchor expression. The main thing, as long as it's unique in this big green box. So the big green box is what they call their smart zone. And what the OCR will do is it'll grab the data in that smart zone. It'll search for your unique phrase, in this case, the word date, and then it's going to align that pink zone up to where that date is. If I wanted to, just for fun, just to kind of give you an example, if I use the word page for here, same story, I could make that there and then slide it up. And then now that's my pink zone for the invoice date. We're just happen to use the word page because it's unique in order for us to align our zones up there. So I'll hit save there. Invoice due date. So some vendors have a due date, some vendors don't. Some people just say they've got terms 10 days. If you notice down here, it looks like I'm kind of looking, it says terms 10 days. So in that case, what I'm going to do is just delete that zone. I'm going to let FileBound, as the invoice comes in, autofill in that zone because it'll be blank, and then FileBound will know what to do with it. So okay, then we got our PO number here. So actually, I'm going to hit the pencil, say no, and then now we're kind of into our spot of PO number. So PO numbers are kind of tricky, because every vendor seems to label their invoice a different way. Some call it customer number, some call it dealer number, there's all sorts of different words. And so, like in this case, it looks like this vendor is using PO and then the word num. Totally fine. So we'll just align that up here and kind of move our field around, and so we're good there. And then simply hit save. And then invoice total. So once we get into the dollar amount field, so think of things like invoice total, discount total, freight, marketing fees, surcharges, taxes, whatever. A lot of times those number fields or amount fields are going to be found at the end of the invoice. So, right now, this particular invoice is simply just a 1-page invoice. That's totally fine. But you might have to account for the fact that it may be multiples. And so sometimes we'll work with the customer and we'll say, okay, well, if this vendor on page 2 doesn't include this header section, that means my total could be anywhere from the top all the way down to the bottom. It really just depends on the vendor. Some vendors, it may be, well, they always include the header, so you probably don't have to make it that tall. And then you could kind of shrink the height down maybe to here. And so every vendor's different. Some vendors actually have a fixed spot. They always go bottom right-hand corner and it's always there. So in this case, it looks like the vendor's probably going to move the invoice total up and down based on how much you purchase. So no big deal. We just make our big zone, our smart zone larger. And then in this case, there's no pink fields. So we'll just click on our expression, we'll come down here and we'll say, okay, if it says final amount, then we grab it and we go from there. Then I'll hit save. And then I don't see a discount field anywhere on here. And for today, I'm just going to say, it looks like this vendor won't give us a field that we can extract for that. And then for freight, just for fun, I guess I'll use this RMF percent. For those that do work with steel, I know this is maybe it's a newer charge, I think. But if we need to add that to your template, just let us know. We can teach you how to do that. But for today, for fun, we'll just kind of say that that's our freight field. We'll grab that, it'll grab the value, and then we'll hit save. So once we've got our field set up and we've got our, if I bounce back a little bit, we've got our original classification set up, then our template's good to go. So we can just simply hit save and apply that to our profile. And then from here on out, any new invoices for steel, we'll grab the data, if you will, and process it from there. So let's take a look at that, but let's go a little bit quicker this time. So I'm going to make sure I get the right vendor number. Yep, there we are. So WIRT 01, and I'm going to click add. So typically this is kind of what you're going to come in and do. Say, okay, Workins, a unique enough name for me. Header, and we can go over here, and we will give our invoice number. Find a better word. Better word we'll use is date. That's fine. Grab that. Better, and then hit save. And same story with our date. Find that to the invoice date here. Finds it to our field. Hit save. Due date. I see within 30 days, so probably don't need that. PO number. Let's see if I can see a PO number. Oh, there it is right there. And we'll just highlight those values. Save. Invoice total. So again, looks like this one's going to float on us. No big deal. I'll just make our zone kind of bigger for fun. Find a better anchor word. And I'm going to do, just for today, freight here. So one thing I want to point out is, didn't want to dive into this too much today, but at least explain it, is that when we have a total like this, but we have the word total elsewhere, we can actually create a custom expression that says only the word total, not followed by the word net amount, if you will. It's really easy for us to do. We kind of have those just saved, if you will, in our arsenal. So if you ever email or call and ask about it, we can get you the value to use for that. It's real simple to do. That we'll say there's no discount, and then we'll say that there's freight, and let's just pretend again that it's one of those vendors that's going to run on from top to bottom. Oops. Pencil. Grab my fields. There's freight, and then we've got our value there. So real simple. Once you kind of do 5 to 10 of these, it's not difficult to make a template by any means. So kind of knowing that and knowing about templates, then one of the questions I get asked quite a bit is, how many templates should we have? What are the numbers we should have? And I always kind of take that back and I say, well, it's important for us to know what your numbers are. And so let me do this. I'm going to click on the home here, spin this batch, and I'm going to minimize. And so a lot of times what I'll ask our customers is to provide us with a list of vendors that they have list of invoices that they've processed in their accounting system in the past 12 months. And then we can kind of take those invoice counts, group them together by vendor number, and then know what our numbers really are. And so, for example, like this customer, I downloaded and they had 16,000 invoices that they processed over the course of 12 months, right? Some of you on the call are much closer to 150,000 invoices, right? Everybody has their own numbers. It's still a percent game. Really doesn't matter, what your numbers are as far as the total count is. What matters is, how do we determine what vendors to template? So just in this example here alone, for them, they're kind of lucky to get to 50% of the invoices that they process to have a template on. They only need 10 vendors. so lucky in that regard. 60%, not very much more. You can see that the gap starts to grow a little bit as we say, okay, 80% of their vendors, if they got 70 templates, they're in good shape. And even down to the degree of now, all of a sudden, though, if you're at 90, you've got to get to 167 templates. So a lot of people kind of find is what's my sweet spot, in that regard. And so this is just kind of a summary of that and what those numbers mean, right? So when you say 80%, you think it's a great number, but you don't really know, what does it mean? So in this example for this customer, if they did 70 templates, that gets them to 13,000 invoices per year that would have a matching template out of 16,000, right? And then what that means is there's 3,324 invoices throughout the year that would come into Capture that does not have a template. Well, if you divide it out by month, it's 277 invoices a month. So then you kind of say, okay, well, maybe our goal is let's get the first 70 knocked out, and then we just have a routine where once or twice a week we make 1 or 2 templates, and then after a few months, next thing you know, we're jumping into that 107 templates created, if you will, and now our numbers start looking like that. And then heck, maybe we just make a routine that once a week we just make 1 template, and start chipping away at that. And next thing you know, after a year, you're going to be looking a lot closer to that 90% of your invoices templated. So a lot of times when we think of templates, we think it's kind of a big lift. Our percentages tell us if it is, so that's what I kind of say about knowing your numbers. But kind of reviewing that data from them, they had 675 total vendors that were active in the past 12 months. And then of that, 428 of those sent 6 invoices or less per year. So that totaled 900 invoices a year, if you will, from those vendors. So you really can kind of look at that 80-20 or 90-10 rule where, most of your invoices hopefully are coming to you from some of the big vendors. So those numbers are important, and it's great. So that way you kind of come up with this, and then you can start check marking off, hey, I made these templates, if you will, right? And where you're at ultimately by tracking that and by doing all that, which is great. So, but what's nice is during implementation, we try to get you to a certain level, and then after that, from there, we can always teach you how to do more, so on and so forth. All right, so what I'm going to do now is hop into this Ditch Witch invoice. I kind of got some information here, whited out a lot of it, but wanted to kind of show you. So here's a PDF, right? And we're going to make a profile today, and we're going to extract just some of the basic information off of it, like invoice number, invoice date, PO number we'll grab, that type of thing. Looks like I don't see a due date. Oh, but I see a discount date. So we could use that as our due date and then our discount amount there. And then looks like some shipping. And then as I kind of go through, you can see I've got multiple invoices from that same vendor, in that same invoice. So now I kind of know what we're dealing with a little bit, and we'll go back into PSI Capture. And then inside of PSI Capture, what I did already, just to save a little bit of time for today, was copied and created a profile. So I copied my profile and I renamed it to Ditch Witch. And then one of the first things that we notice is that, okay, we've got a single PDF, and we're gonna have to break it apart. So we can easily create a separation rule that says, hey, when we're looking at the page, let's look at this area of the page. And then when we see page 1 of, that's going to be our trigger to create a new to create a new invoice, if you will, to split those apart automatically. Another way that you could do it is you could say, hey, every time that invoice number changes, automatically create a new invoice as well. So that's all possible. So I'll do that. And that's kind of what we have our rules there. And so that's what we kind of pre-created already. And then in our indexing side of things, what we just simply did was, made sure we had the right fields. And, in that first PDF we looked at, all we had was freight and a total. But as we kind of scroll through that document, we actually have a lot of other different dollar amounts that we can extract off of that template. So I kind of added those fields just ahead of time, so we didn't have to kind of make those, and then pre-created zones, just like what we saw before. And then now we'll go ahead and go through our template process. But what's also nice with this is, since we know all the invoices for this profile are going to be this vendor, I'm just going to default that field to be that for the vendor name. And then in the vendor number, I'm just going to default the vendor number, because we don't need to make it rocket science. We just need to make it so that's it's efficient and functional and reliable. So that's what we've got there. So that's our profile. And then to create the template, I'll just simply do the same as what we just kind of did. So we'll do our capture import, choose our ditch witch profile. And because I've got the auto split, created, then I'll go ahead and just highlight this and let that OCR kind of do its thing. And so in essence, what's happening now is the OCR is looking at that pink zone in the upper right-hand corner. And every time it sees the word phrase page 1 of, then it means that's the first page of the invoice. So it's going to then automatically break those apart. And that's kind of what's happening right now. Okay, so then I'm going to hit close batch, and we'll move that invoice forward. You can see it's going to say it's not classified because it didn't find a template, since we obviously haven't created one yet. And just run the OCR through those documents so we can use that data. All right, so I'm going to copy this vendor number, and just like what we just did, is I'm going to hit this new classification form. I'm going to make that the vendor name there, and just for today, why don't I do Charles Machine as my keyword header, and we'll get into our fields. Okay, so again, what we're doing right now is nothing more complicated than what we did just before. It's just that we happen to be in a different profile. And so that looks good to me. We'll hit save. Our invoice date looks like it's right next to it, so that's great. So we'll just slide this guy up. Maybe resize this a little bit. A tip on zooming. So let's say that was a little bit harder to read, based on your monitor. I kind of seen people like click on the zoom and try to, get good enough, right? I'm a big fan of just like clicking this like 10 times. You can just go crazy, and then slide your slider over, and then align it that way. Everybody has their own preference, but just want to share that a lot of times when I'm zooming in, that's exactly how I do it. So due date. So if I remember right, yeah. So we were looking at this area over here, and it looks like this will float up and down depending upon how much we purchase as well. And so what we want to do is take this zone, and I think if we use paid by, let's do that as our anchor, and then we can grab this here. Okay, and then let's go to PO number, modify that field, just do the word customer. Oh, not going to work because there's 2 different fields there. So let's try customer PO. There we go. Just got the one zone. Actually lined itself up perfectly. So we'll just hit save. Invoice total. Same story. Looks like it's going to float on us. So let's just make that different size here. Edit it. And you'll see me, old habits are hard to break. So before we had the pencil, we used to have to resize it and then double click it. And so now that we have that pencil, it's so much easier just to use it. But sometimes my habit takes over and I use it the old way. All right, discount. So yeah, discount is assuming we're going to pay by that day, right? So everyone's a little bit different in how they like to handle discount. Because we're extracting the data off of this document, my theory is that, hey, let's assume we're going to be efficient, and that let's assume we're going to every day get these invoices into FileBound, and let's assume we're going to get it processed on time. So let's go ahead and extract that value. Then, worst case scenario, when it comes time to enter that into our accounting system or create the voucher, what have you, we can always get rid of that discount from our field inside of FileBound. Or if nothing else, now we've got a field in FileBound where we can kind of track discounts that we should have made, right? Or discounts that we were able to take advantage of. So it's kind of a nice way just to have the data available to us in FileBound and then let you kind of figure out where to go from there. Okay, so what's interesting then is on this invoice, we don't have a parts priority surcharge and we don't have a restock fee. So in that case, because I know that that's going to be there, just not there on this invoice, I'm going to actually leave those zones there for the moment. And I'm going to hit save here and have that get saved. And we'll say yes. And then let's take a look and see, once it's kind of done reprocessing those, if we can find another invoice that has that particular value. So let's, oh, great. So here's one. So our number 2 has a parts priority surcharge, doesn't have a restock fee. Let's kind of see if we can find the one that has both. And I'm just really honestly using the arrow on my keyboard to kind of just navigate through each one of these different invoices to see if I can get lucky and get both of those on there. I did see something else. I'll point that out in a little bit. Interesting. Okay, so I'm not. So that's okay. So I see. Let's go back up to document number 2, and then let's edit this template. So when I click edit there, it's going to bring in the document, if you will, that I'm actually looking at. So you can see now our invoice has changed, and now we've got the parts priority surcharge. So when I go to the zone and go to that field, I'm going to click the edit pencil there, and just like we would normally, kind of resize it. It's found that phrase automatically, which is awesome. And then we just realign our zone and then hit save. And so I'm going to hit save again. And now I think if I remember right, it was maybe 16 had the restock fee. Yeah, 16 did. All right, so let me hit the edit pencil. Oops. So I'm going to hit the edit pencil top. Again, it brought in our new form, which is awesome. So we'll go to our zone profile, click restock fee. And set that up. And we'll grab that field there. So I'm going to hit save there, and I'll say no. And then there's another thing that I noticed as we were kind of going through this that stood out to me of something we should take a look at. So you'll notice like on this invoice, it says shipping and handling, but then when I get to number 9, you'll see they change it to the word freight. And so let's say that we want to have both of those values into our freight field, if you will, regardless of if it's freight or if it's not. So then what I'll do is I'll hit this edit icon here, and I'll go to my general here. And then for my freight field, what I'm going to do is hit this pencil here. And then it looks like, okay, it looks like we've got it already. So let me modify this real quick. Okay, perfect. So let's assume that, our first go at this template, we created that field and we just use the word shipping and handling, right? So we come in here and we see there's freight, but we still want to grab that to the same field. So this is getting a little bit more advanced, but what we can do is we can actually edit this expression really easily by, cutting that kind of value out and saying, okay, we want to grab the word freight, and it'll generate that expression. And then also I'm going to paste the shipping and handling back in with the pipe character, which means freight or shipping, if you will. And then I'll hit save. And now you can see it highlights that zone. So now no matter what, whether it was shipping or whether it was freight, we're still going to grab that value and then save it in to our field that we want, and then process the batch, kind of from there. And so that's really ultimately the goal is to come up with a way to have a batch of invoices, run them through, make sure we're grabbing all the data that we want, and then kind of run through it. And so let's say that all that worked well, and we're uploading to FileBound, and it's been, I don't know, a few weeks, and you reach back out to us and you say, hey, we've been running this particular profile for a while, haven't had to make any changes. Life's been pretty good. It's grabbing all the data that we want. Let's now turn on the automation. So then what we would do is work with you to go back into the settings of that profile, and we would remove that quality assurance step, and we would simply say, okay, in the Ditch Witch profile, we would look at our workflow and we'd say, okay, instead of having a quality assurance step, we would just drop that off. And then normally you'd have a FileBound profile in there too that would map everything into FileBound. But we drop that quality assurance step off. That way it can automatically do the capture, the classification, the index, and then push directly into FileBound. And then of course we can set up to do an auto import where we can monitor certain folders and grab that data and kind of go from there. And again, we'd want to work with you on that so we can kind of identify, how do we want to monitor those? Are you going to drop documents down there, once a day, multiple times a day, that type of thing. And that way we kind of have that timing set up and all that, what workstation do we do the server, all those types of things. So lots to consider, of course, but think of it this way, in about 12 minutes, plus maybe about 10 minutes of setup. So maybe 30 minutes, we created a profile in PSI Capture for, a large vendor, if you will, that we can then try to get to an automated step and go from there. So fun things for sure in that regard. Okay, so what I'm going to hop in is check out some of the questions here and see if I can't kind of answer those for you. Let's see. Good question on the discount. So, when we're thinking about an invoice and grabbing the data off of it, the question is, does it have to be a dollar amount or could it be a percentage? And so one of the challenges is if it's a dollar amount, that's obviously pretty easy to do. If it's a percentage, we can certainly extract that, but then PSI Capture, typically we don't set that up to perform the math. We can, and it's not difficult to do, but a lot of times what we try to kind of segregate the difference between PSI Capture and FileBound is let's let PSI Capture extract all of the data. And then once the data gets pushed into FileBound, let FileBound do the math or do the updates or do those kind of things, just so that way we kind of have that segregation. And another kind of reason we do that as well is at some point, we've had customers where maybe the person that starts off doing the PSI Capture, for example, 2 years in, they then happen to have a secretary or assistant or an intern for the summer or somebody like that maybe doesn't know all of the accounting things. So if we keep PSI as the tool that's extracting data, it's easy to kind of hand off that job function permanently or temporarily to another employee. They don't necessarily have to know accounting per se to grab data off of it. But let's talk about a scenario that if you did grab the percentages off of, of that invoice inside of PSI Capture. So if we uploaded that data, then what we'd have to do is kind of build some rules in FileBound to understand what we're looking at, if you will, right? So we probably have a field that we would upload it to that maybe it says 10% term 15, for example. So we'd say, okay, then by vendor number, we'd have to come up with rules that would say, all right, for this vendor number, it's going to be 10% discount, for example, but that isn't going to be applied to freight, or it's not going to be applied to taxes, or it's not going to be. So we kind of have to know all those rules in order to do the math. It's certainly possible. It's tough because there's a lot of rules, if you will. So awesome. Yes, great question. On the next question is it possible to delete when they're no longer being used or they're being used incorrectly? So I'm glad that you asked that because that is exactly one of the things I wanted to cover today. So in a scenario where I've got a situation where I've got an invoice comes in, let's just say it's Johnson and Sons, Inc. And I put it into Capture, I bring it to the indexing step, but the vendor name says, Kubota, for example, right? And so the question is it a Johnson and Sons template problem, or is it a Kubota template problem? And the answer would be it's a Kubota template problem because it looked at the Johnson and Sons invoice and thought that it was a Kubota invoice. So we have to either modify, or tweak or adjust those templates. And to do that, basically, you'd have to have one of your admins get into the settings and configurations section here, and then you would go to your particular profile. So in this case, we'll just go to our standard profile that we're using earlier. And when I go into here, I want to go into the workflow. And inside of the workflow, if I go into the classification kind of section here, this lists out all of our different forms and zones, if you will. So in here, let's just say, we've got this particular template and we want to just delete it. So that's pretty easy. All we would have to do is come over to the zone profile triggered and delete that zone by clicking edit. And then we simply just delete that zone out of there. And then once we're done deleting that zone, we would then take this whole classification and then delete that. So if you kind of remember when we build a template, it's a two-part template. So we have to also delete it in two ways. One, we have to delete the zones out, and then two, we have to delete the classification ID. Or if our issue is we just need to modify our template, then if you don't have that invoice in the batch to modify it, you can come in here and modify it as well and say, okay, for this vendor, this is our anchor word, but it's not unique, enough for what we're trying to do. So maybe what I need to do is add one, and I'm going to include, just for fun, this fax number as part of my anchor as well. And so now from here on out, that vendor will have to be use the name and the number so it doesn't accidentally grab the Johnson and Sons painting, invoice, that kind of thing. So two kind of things we covered there: an aggressive template, meaning that it wasn't specific enough in our classification, or two, if we just wanted to delete one out, where we would go to delete that out. So again, the delete's a two-part thing. We've got to get rid of the zones, and then we got to get rid of that profile there. So great question. Yeah, and actually, so the follow-up question, or the additional question there about the working invoice. So it's a invoice that comes through and it's being labeled as working. So what that means is exactly kind of this, where when I go into that template, the words that we're using for classification are too general, meaning that it's existing on other invoices too. So we have to be maybe a little bit more specific in that word. And I think we had to work in what we just did, right? So let's edit that guy. And if we're in here and we're looking at this and we say, oh, this word's too generic, again, we simply just add another one, or we can delete this field too and say, oh, I don't want to do this. I want to do work in America. So then I'll click add this plus sign and then simply grab, work in America. So now maybe it's a little bit more specific, or, sometimes, it's maybe you toggle it from being a header to a zone, just depending upon what you're running into, that sort of thing. Another question just popped in and said, what happens if we deleted a zone, but we need to put it back in? And that's a really good question as well. So let's say we were in this process and actually, let's go. Yeah, so let's say we're in this process and we said, hey, we goofed and we deleted our freight field, for example, and we need to add it back in. So to add it back in, above the image itself, there is a little T icon. So it's our draw our smart zone, but it's got a little light bulb on it. I don't know if you can see that very well in the meeting, but that's kind of what that icon is. And once I click on that, you'll see my cursor change into a square. I can just simply make a square. It doesn't matter where I make it. And then I can kind of align it. So let's, again, pretend it was just freight that was deleted. Now, I don't have that anchor line and I don't have the child line. No big deal. All we have to do is just click add. So add the anchor. Now we're back to where we need to use our T to find something that's unique. Let's say the word freight. And then again, nothing pops up in our pink zone simply because we don't have that here. And if I go add zone here, then you can see now it adds my zone and I resize it. And when I hit save, it's like I never left. And then the trick then, of course, is then using this drop down to labeling it to the field I want. And just for fun for right now, I'll just call it discount. And so that way, that will map the data from the zone to the field inside of PSI Capture because we've already kind of created that. So I will exit out of here without saving. Yes. Normally you would hit save and go from there. So it is, typical that each kind of customer would maybe appoint somebody to get into here because obviously you wouldn't want everybody jumping into the admin side of PSI Capture. We definitely can give you some help, in identifying how to do those things again. I think the video will be great once we'll send out the links this week, and we'll include a couple documents. One, how to process an invoice, just that way if you've got somebody new that shows up and maybe that's a good tool to give them. And then another document of how just to create a template from scratch. We won't go through all the oops, I goofed types of things that we kind of covered today in the video, but I think that'll be a great tool for you kind of moving forward. Also to mention, the intention is to do these videos again, right? So as we work with our customers and we learn what you liked about it, what you didn't like about it, maybe we should have added more types of things, or maybe it was great. We just need to do it again, So then kind of look for in August timeline of another round of capture, if you will, webinars. And then kind of the intention is in July, we might dive a little bit more specific. So we'll kind of talk with you and find out, the details that you want. So some of our customers are using, for example, the IntelliDeal software. So we've got a integration with them. Some of our customers are using like a software called Equip. We've got a tighter integration with them. Now that's being kind of tested out. And so kind of give you updates and what we need to do on that, all that fun stuff. So we'll be able to make a lot of fun webinars, I think. Okay, so another good question someone asked was about, how to reverse an invoice, on the amount, if it's positive versus negative and that sort of thing. So let me answer that, which is a great question. And I actually think I forgot to cover that yesterday, not that you mentioned it. So I'm glad that you brought it up. When I go into, let's see here. Let's just open this guy up into index. Okay, so a lot of times, and I don't have this in my demo, unfortunately, but a lot of times when we set up the profiles for you as a customer, there will be a field at the bottom called invoice type. And we'll default that to the word invoice, but you can toggle that to the word credit. And some background kind of history on that. So when we first really started with OCR, the way that all of these zones worked was you ultimately only given a ping zone, and that was the way to do it, and that was the greatest thing ever. Except back then everything was scanned and your pages shifted and you never could get lucky enough to get the data correct, so you really had to get good scanners to get the paper lined up. So then over time, that kind of evolved, and what they said was, well, what if we give you a keyword, if you will, and then from that keyword you can place your ping zone. So that was a good idea, right? So you could say, okay, if I find the word page, then put my ping zone over here. Well, the problem was, you couldn't predict what vendors would put on here. They might have the word page here or page there. So you had to deal with duplicates. So they kind of had to add some processes for that. But at the same time, it really wasn't great. And then as it evolved even further, we kind of got to the point where we're at with PSI now, where they say, all right, let's give ourselves what we call a smart zone. Let's only worry about the data inside of there and grab the data we want. That's great. So once we kind of got to that part, then we started looking at what else can we tweak and make better. So a lot of the focus came to if it's an invoice versus a credit. And so we started looking at invoices with our customers and said, hey, what is it we can do to make sure it's a negative, et cetera. And after tons and tons of failed attempts, ultimately, and the reason we're not having success is because like this might be a credit, just for example, for IDM, they might even call that an invoice number, which we all know that if it's a credit, that certainly is not an invoice number, right? It should be a credit memo number or a credit number or something of that nature. And then when it comes down to the amounts, they may put a negative sign in front. They might put a negative sign at the end. They might do parentheses. They might do a different color. They might change the font a little bit, or they might do nothing at all. And you just have to know that based off of the information on here that, oh, this is a credit memo, in essence. And so from an OCR and a template standpoint, we just struggled. There wasn't a consistent way across vendors to honestly say, what do we do? How do we do it, et cetera. So what we've kind of come up with over the years is that invoice type field. And what you would see in your PSI Capture profile is a field down below, just a drop down. We defaulted to the word invoice because probably 80–90% of the documents that you process through here are going to be invoices. Then that way, when you run your template and it fills in all the data and you're tabbing through and making sure everything looks great, and you get down to your department location field, and if that's not automatically filled in, or if you need to fill it in, again, based on your rules, you can enter that in, and then when you hit tab, you would tab into that invoice type field, and you could hit the down arrow on your keyboard or the letter C if you needed to move to credit. But again, hopefully 80+% of the time you didn't have to. And so once it's toggled as credit down below, and we upload the invoice into FileBound, then we can build rules in FileBound if we don't have them already for you. That says if it says the word credit in that invoice type field during the upload, then FileBound will analyze it and it'll look at all of the different fields and will again determine with you what fields should always be negative. So if it's credit, if the invoice total, if you will, should be negative, then we'll say, all right, is the invoice total negative, yes or no? And if the answer is no, we'll add a dash in front. And then that way, as a templated customer, you won't have to go through and add a negative sign to each one of these different fields. You can only worry about toggling that invoice type field to kind of a back and forth, if you will. So kind of a long answer, but boy, it would be great if all vendors simply just agreed on using the word credit memo or credit, on every time they send a credit. And so that'd be kind of fun. All right. So yeah, so our intention, last question looks like is our intention is to get these videos and links out to everybody this week. Again, appreciate everybody jumping on. We had a good mix yesterday and today of folks that are using PSI Capture today, and folks that were using the FileBound Capture as well, just to kind of get a look and see what what we're doing with this product, and if there's value there, if it's even as simple as us working with you to help you identify those numbers, send us an email. We can get you scheduled over the next, month, sometime in July, if you will, and kind of cover all of those different items and see, again, if there's adjustments that can be made or automation that we can help you out with. So we're always open to help. Just kind of let us know what we need to do and we'll go from there. So let me check questions one last time. I don't think we have any more, and are right on time. So again, appreciate everybody. Always appreciate your business. You're certainly a fun group to work with. So appreciate that. And we will talk soon. Have a great day.